In this tutorial, we are going to discuss digital and handmade collage. Now, before we begin, we really do need to look back through art history and look at the origins of collage within contemporary art. And to do that, we need to look at the Dada movement. So what is Dadaism? So in this next clip, curators from the National Galleries of Scotland discuss this particular time period and the artists that have influenced it.
The First World War was one of the most destructive wars in our history. It was during this time that the avant-garde movement Dada emerged, partly as a negative reaction to the horrors of war. Primarily a literary and artistic movement, Dada emerged almost simultaneously in several cities in Europe and America. It was in Zurich's Cabaret Voltaire Club in 1916 that the movement was first founded by Hugo Ball and Emmy Hennings, with other members including German-French sculptor Hans Arp and Tristan Tzara, a French-Romanian avant-garde poet. In New York, Marcel Duchamp and Francis Picabia, who were most associated with Dadaist ideas of anti-art, revolutionised ideas of what constituted an artwork, with Duchamp famously coining the term ready-made to describe his found object art, which transformed the conventions of visual art. French-born Picabia, a highly versatile artist, worked using a number of styles throughout his life. He experimented with Impressionism and Cubism, but it was for his work with the New York Dada group that he became most noted. Influenced by his friend Marcel Duchamp and by the enthusiasm for mechanisation in America, Picabia began depicting the machine in his work. Like Duchamp, Picabia had a taste for paradox and the absurd. He was never afraid to court unconventionality, and his works often had hidden, ironic meanings. The Zurich group published a Dada magazine and held numerous art exhibitions spreading their anti-war, anti-art ideas. They also had regular events with experimental poetry readings, music and dancing, and Tzara and Arp famously explored chance through ripping up and scattering paper pieces onto the floor. Dada continued to spread at the end of the World War, with groups in Paris and Berlin, among other cities. Those who participated in Club Dada in Berlin included George Gross and Hannah Hoch. Collage was favoured over more traditional techniques by many Dada artists, including Hoch, who is best known for producing satirical and disturbing photomontages like Untitled, from the collection From an Ethnographical Museum. Her work often focused on the situation in Weimar Germany from a woman's perspective, combining political commentary, gender issues, questions of modernity, and a critique of the bourgeoisie. In the early 1920s, many Dada artists had converged in Paris, including Arp, Ernst, Duchamp, and Picabia, where André Breton and others had begun to formulate the ideas that would become Surrealism. Although the movement was essentially brought to an end with the emergence of Surrealism, Dada is now considered a watershed moment in 20th century art. In the 1960s, artists like Joseph Beuys were also referred to as neo-Dadists for their promotion of living anti-art. Artists influenced by Dada's radical ideas reached beyond the visual arts and into music, with the likes of Frank Zappa and David Bowie using Dadaist techniques, collaging lyrics and musical composition. Bowie also famously showed the continuing impact of Dada through costume. Developed amidst the darkness of World War I, this anti-art movement had its focal point in the nonsensical and absurd. Dadaism echoed the marked disillusionment of the time and concerned itself with the absence of meaning and the inevitability of chance in life events. If being anti-art means rejecting the styles and sensibilities of the day to make way for fresh thinking and approaches, what artistic struggle could there be?
So as discussed in that short film, Dadaism was very much anti-art, anti-war and anti-politics. And in some cases, or shall I say some artists in that movement, were actually considered themselves being anti-Dada as well. Now here's a list of some of those artists that are linked to this movement and linked to the Cabaret Voltaire. So if you're interested in researching this movement further, have a look at these artists. The most significant piece of work, arguably, should I say, the most significant piece of work that was produced in this period was by an artist called Marcel Duchamp, and the piece was entitled The Fountain. Now in this next video, the curator of the Scottish National Gallery discusses the importance of this piece.
This is a really classic example of Dada, anti-art, attacking the art establishment, substituting an object bought in a plumber's shop for sculpture. So an object that was bound to cause offence.
He was testing censorship and testing what people thought of as art. So the traditional idea of getting a lump of clay, fashioning it into something that resembles a human face, was anathema to him, and I think it was just old-fashioned. It wasn't right for the machine age. So he bought these machine-made things and decided to stick them into exhibitions, but not thinking that they were art, always just to test what people would think of them.
What strikes me about the fountain is that although it's a male object, in the sense that it's used by men, it's not, of course, in the position it would normally be in a lavatory. And placed as it is, it's got a feminine form, a sort of hip-like shape. And I can't help seeing the elements of it, the plumbing elements, as female. The signature, of course, is also a bit of a provocation. Mott. Apparently this is a sort of pun or a kind of derivation from the Mott Works Company, which made urinals. But of course it's Duchamp signing the object, but not with his own name. So again, an attack on the idea of the artist, the authenticity of the artist, the price of the artist's signature.
The magazine or journal was very much the vehicle, or the most radical vehicle, for the Dada movement. And in fact, because a lot of the things they made were very ephemeral, it's often the only evidence that we have of what they were doing. This edition, there were 2 editions of The Blind Man made. It was really to shake America out of its apathy and its very conventional attitudes to art. The front cover here shows a photograph of Marcel Duchamp's brailleuse de chocolat, chocolate grinder, and then inside you have a wonderful photograph by Alfred Stieglitz of the fountain. And the final paragraphs, Duchamp says, or Beatrice Wood says, whether Mr. Mutt with his own hands made the fountain or not has no importance. He chose it, and chose in capital letters. He took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view. This created a new thought for that object. So this is really a statement of the whole sort of rationale behind the fountain.
And that's the big thing about the fountain. What is art? It's the basic thing that every schoolboy sort of starts with around 16. You sort of wonder why is this art? Why is that not art? And it starts with Duchamp. But it took some years. It wasn't at that point. It didn't create a huge furore. He wrote this little pamphlet. There were a few bits and bobs in a few magazines at the time, but not an enormous amount.
When this object was actually exhibited in New York, its implications for contemporary sculpture I don't think were understood, because people hadn't seen Picasso's Cubist works, which were made a few years earlier, which incorporated real objects in them. And they hadn't seen either Duchamp's other ready-mades, which he was in effect displaying in his own studio. So they didn't know how 20th century sculpture was going to be viewed. With hindsight, we can see this as an absolute turning point. and having an enormous impact on the development of 20th century sculpture from really the post-First World War period onwards, right through up to the present day, with artists using objects from real life. But I think in 1917, it was really the gesture itself, the provocation, a kind of up yours gesture, which is what this represented.
Now let's look at some artists that use collage within their work.